The baptismal register of St. Brendan's parish was not meant to be dramatic. It was a thick book, bound in dark leather. Its pages ruled into columns by hand: date, name of the child, parents, residence, minister, remarks. It existed to remove ambiguity from life, to make souls legible to the Church, to God, and to the state that increasingly relied on church records to define who counted. In 1891, the book was already worn. The corners of its pages had softened from decades of fingers turning them after Mass. Ink bled slightly where quills had pressed too long. Some entries were neat. Others were hurried, cramped, and written by men late for something else. And then there was one entry that did not resolve. A baptism was performed, a name written, and then carefully, deliberately crossed out, not erased, not torn away, crossed out. The child's name was Mare Ní Chathasai. She was born in the western edge of Galway, where land dissolved gradually into stone and wind. Her family lived on a small holding near the coast, thin soil, low yields, and a dependence on seasonal labor that kept everyone perpetually behind. Her mother, Bridget, had delivered at home, assisted by an older woman from the parish. The father, Sean, was present only briefly. He would later say he had already known something was wrong, though he never clarified what that meant. 3 days after birth, Mare was carried to St. Brendan's. The church was cold even in summer. Stone walls held damp like memory. The baptismal font stood near the entrance, not out of welcome, but theology. The child passed through water before entering anything else. Father Aidan Walsh performed the rite. The water was poured. The words were spoken. The sign of the cross was traced on the child's forehead. And the parish register recorded it. For 2 days Mare existed on paper as baptized. Then the diocese intervened. This story does not begin with malice. It begins with procedure. In late 19th century Ireland, the Catholic Church did not merely guide spiritual life, it administered it. Baptism was not symbolic. It was jurisdictional. It determined burial rights, legitimacy, inheritance, marriage eligibility, and quietly, increasingly, how the civil world would treat a person. A baptism recognized by a parish but refused by a diocese created a problem. Problems attract paperwork. On a gray morning, less than a week after the baptism, Father Walsh received a letter bearing the diocesan seal. The letter was short. It referenced an irregularity. It requested clarification regarding the circumstances of the child's condition at birth. And it advised, not commanded, that recognition of the sacrament be withheld until further review. There was no mention of sin, no accusation. No theology was explained, just a pause, a procedural pause. And paperwork attracts silence. Father Walsh had served in the parish long enough to understand the weight of such pauses. They did not end quickly. They expanded. He returned to the register. He found the entry, and with a ruler placed carefully beneath the line, he drew 2 parallel strokes through Mare's name, not violently, not angrily, with precision. Crossing out a baptism did not undo the ritual, but it did suspend recognition, and recognition, in the Church's administrative reality, was everything. Without it, the child existed in a liminal state, neither safely within sacrament nor officially outside it, a soul waiting on correspondence. Why would a diocese refuse to acknowledge a baptism that had already been performed? The register does not say, the letter does not survive. What remains are margins, and the margins Speak quietly. In the remarks column. Next to the crossed-out name, someone later added a note in smaller handwriting. Status deferred pending clarification. Deferred. Not denied. Not accepted. Deferred. A word. That allowed time to do its work. Mare did not know any of this. She slept, cried, fed, and survived the fragile early weeks that claimed so many children in rural Galway. Her mother brought her back to the church for Mass. She was held at the back, not yet presented again. No one announced anything. No one explained. Silence was maintained carefully. As one maintains a boundary, the late 1800s were a period of tightening definitions. Church. Authorities across Ireland were increasingly pressured to standardize records. Rome demanded clarity. Civil registration offices demanded alignment. Ambiguity was no longer tolerated quietly. Children born under unusual circumstances, those delivered prematurely, those who failed to cry immediately, and those who appeared physically ambiguous, were no longer simply baptized conditionally and forgotten. They were reviewed, assessed, categorized, and sometimes they were paused. At 3 months old, Mare became ill. Nothing dramatic. A fever, weakness, the kind of illness that often resolved or didn't. Bridget walked again to St. Brendan's. The child wrapped tightly against the wind. She asked about the baptism. She asked whether it had been recorded. She asked whether her daughter would be buried and consecrated. Ground if the worst happened. Father Walsh did not answer immediately. He consulted the register. He saw the lines. He saw the note and he told her carefully that the matter was under review. Under review by whom? Bridget did not ask. People in Galway understood that some questions did not travel upward. They returned damaged. No formal investigation followed. No physician's report was attached. No theological ruling was issued, at least. None was preserved. What followed instead was something more dangerous. Delay. Throughout this story, delay will appear again and again. Delay of ink, delay of recognition, delay of responsibility. Each delay will be justified as caution. Each will leave someone waiting. Mare survived the illness. She grew. She was a quiet child, described later by a neighbor as watchful. She spoke later than others, walked carefully, as if unsure of the ground. Children noticed differences long before institutions named them. So did priests. In 1894, Father Walsh was reassigned, the register passed to another hand, and the crossed-out entry remained. No follow-up note was added. No resolution recorded. The diocese did not revisit the case. Or if it did not write back. What happens to a person whose baptism is neither denied nor accepted? What happens when a system designed to save souls chooses instead to wait? Mare grew up attending Mass but never serving. She was not formally catechized with her peers. Her name did not appear on the First Communion list. When asked, the explanation was always administrative. There is an issue with the record. Records in this period were not reflections of reality. They were reality. And Mare was slowly being defined by an absence. At age 12, she asked her mother why she could not stand with the others. Bridget did not answer immediately. She had learned that silence was inherited. The diocese never sent another letter, but the crossed-out lines remained visible. They darkened with time. Ink sinks deeper into paper. The longer it is left undisturbed. In 1906, a new curate arrived in St. Brendan's. He noticed the entry. He asked questions that had not been asked before, and he sent a letter of his own to the diocesan office, requesting clarification on a baptism crossed out. 15 years earlier, the response he received would not mention mayor's name. It would not mention theology. It would not mention mercy. It would cite policy. To uncover the next part of this story, the policy that justifiedselence and the category it quietly created. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The letter arrived folded once and sealed tightly, and as the curate began to read, he realized that the church had already decided what mayor was allowed to be and what it would never formally say out loud. The letter from the diocesan office did not begin with a greeting. It began with a reference number, a sequence of digits written in the upper corner, lightly underlined, tying the inquiry not to a person, but to a file that already existed somewhere else. The curate, Father Michael O'Rourke, noticed this immediately. He had asked a question about a child. The response assumed a case. This was how institutions remembered things. Without admitting they remembered them at all. The letter was brief, formal, and careful to avoid detail. It acknowledged receipt of his inquiry. It confirmed that the baptism in question had been subject to review at the time of its recording. It stated that no further action was required by the parish, and it concluded with a sentence that appeared repeatedly in diocesan correspondence of the era. The matter is to be considered resolved under existing guidance. Resolved. Without resolution. No explanation followed. No guidance was enclosed. No instruction was given for how the child. Now, a young woman was to be treated sacramentally. The letter closed the inquiry by declaring it unnecessary, and in doing so, it revealed something important. The diocese did not see the crossed-out baptism as a mistake. It saw it as a correct application of policy. By the late 19th century, Catholic dioceses across Europe and its former territories had quietly formalized rules for what they called dubia cases of doubt. These were not rare. Children born during medical emergencies, infants delivered without clear signs of life, bodies that did not conform to expected classifications, souls whose status could not be easily confirmed. The solution was not always denial. Often, it was suspension. Suspension allowed authority to protect itself. A sacrament fully denied could be contested. A sacrament conditionally granted required documentation, but a sacrament deferred could be left unresolved indefinitely. The ambiguity absorbed responsibility. Father O'Rourke returned to the register. He traced the crossed-out name with his finger. He noticed something Father Walsh may not have intended. The lines did not obscure the name completely. They framed it. They marked it as exceptional. If this was policy, he wondered, where is it written? The answer was not in parish books. It was not in catechisms. It was not taught in seminaries. The guidance existed elsewhere, circulated privately among bishops, chancellors, and canon lawyers. It lived in correspondence. In memoranda. Instructions are never meant to be read aloud. This is how dangerous knowledge moves, not by proclamation. By quiet agreement. Rourke requested access to older diocesan files. He was granted limited permission. Folders were brought to him tied with string. Their labels faded, cases involving annulments, burials denied, marriages delayed. And occasionally, baptisms marked with annotations that did not resolve. In one file from 1872, a similar note appeared: baptism administered, recognition withheld pending certainty of condition. No further explanation. In another, from 1888, entry crossed, no action required. Again, no follow-up. What condition required such certainty? The files did not say, they did not need to. Those reading them already understood. The Church, like the medical institutions, it increasingly consulted, had adopted a classification problem. Not all bodies fit easily into the categories doctrine had inherited. Some children were born with characteristics that unsettled sacramental certainty, and uncertainty was treated not as amistary but as a risk. Mère Ni Chathesai was now 19. She worked occasionally as a seamstress. She attended Mass. She remained unconfirmed. She knew, by then, that something about her had been quietly noted and quietly avoided, but no one told her what living without explanation is its own kind of discipline. You learn to watch how others respond to you. You learn what questions are never answered. You learn where your name does not appear. When Mare applied for work in a nearby town, she was asked for proof of sacramental status, a letter from her parish confirming baptism. Father O'Rourke hesitated. The register could not support the request. He wrote instead a letter describing her as known to the parish. It was returned incomplete. The system did not accuse her. It simply could not place her. And so it excluded her without explanation. This was the harm of classification. Not punishment, not condemnation, but removal from pathways others move through without noticing. How many lives are shaped not by what institutions dickle, but by what they quietly decline to clarify? O'Rourke wrote again to the diocese. This time, he asked directly whether the baptism could be regularized. The response took longer. Weeks passed. Months. Silence extended. Delay did not signal uncertainty. It signaled comfort. The diocese was comfortable leaving the matter unresolved. When the reply finally came, it was more explicit but still incomplete. It referenced guidance issued in the previous decade. It stated that cases involving ambiguous corporeal presentation at birth were to be treated with caution. It did not define the phrase. It did not need to. The letter concluded, public clarification is neither required nor advisable. Not advisable. This was no longer about theology. It was about containment. Father O'Rourke folded the letter carefully. He did not show it to Mare. He did not know how. How do you explain that your existence has been categorized as something best left unspoken? The Church did not name Ma'ir. It did not name what troubled it. It simply created a procedural shadow around her life. This was not unique to Galway. Across Europe, similar cases appeared in margins and footnotes, children marked as insertee, records annotated, then left untouched. Lives defined by the absence of a stamp. What does it mean to belong to a faith that will not say whether you belong? In 1911, Ireland conducted a census. Enumerators asked questions. Names, ages, religions. When Mare's entry was recorded, the box for religious affiliation was left blank. Not crossed out, left empty. Emptiness travels. It follows a person into every system that asks them to define themselves. If you want to understand how this silence shaped the rest of Mare's life, and how the Church ensured it would never be discussed, openly subscribe and turn on notifications, because in 1913, something changed. A new bishop took office. And with him came a review of old cases. Files were reopened, registers examined, decisions reconsidered, not out of mercy, but efficiency. And when Mare's name surfaced again, faint beneath the old cross lines, the question was no longer whether her baptism could be recognized, but whether correcting the record would expose something the Church had spent decades teaching itself not to see. When the new bishop assumed office in the Diocese of Galway in 1913, he inherited more than parishes. He inherited archives, boxes sealed with twine, registers no one had opened in years. Cases are no longer remembered by name, only by notation. The stated purpose of the review was administrative efficiency. The diocese was preparing for alignment with updated canonical guidance. Records needed to be clean. Categories needed to be consistent. Ambiguities needed to be either resolved or quietly stabilized. It was not a moral initiative. It was a structural one. In the Chancery office, a clerk lifted the baptismal register of St. Brendan's and placed it on a long table beneath a window clouded by salt air. Page by page, entries were scanned, most passed without comment. And then the crossed out lines appeared. Ink does not fade evenly. The name beneath the lines, Mayor Ni Chathasai, had darkened with age. It refused to disappear. The clerk marked the page with a slip of paper. A marginal note was added to a separate ledger. Unresolved sacramental status. See correspondence. The file was pulled. What remained of it? The file was thin. A letter from 1891, no longer complete. A diocesan response referencing existing guidance. No medical report. No theological ruling. No final determination. Just delay preserved as outcome. This posed a problem for the review, not because the case was complicated, but because it was incomplete. Incomplete cases could not be easily categorized, and categories were the entire point. By the early 20th century, church authorities had increasingly adopted the language of administration. Souls were still discussed, but systems ran on classification. Regular. Irregular. Conditional. Deferred. Anything left undefined threatened the coherence of the whole. The bishop, whose name does not appear in the surviving notes, did not examine Mayor's case personally. He did not need to. A subcommittee was formed. Canon lawyers reviewed precedent. Medical opinions from earlier decades were summarized. Abstractly. Language was chosen carefully, not to describe a person, but a type. At no point was Mayor consulted. At no point was she examined. At no point was her life referenced beyond the original notation at birth. This was not a review of a human being. It was a review of a category. Institutions. Preferred types to people. Types do not age. They do not speak back. They do not suffer visibly. The committee's conclusion was recorded in a memorandum never meant for parish distribution. It stated that cases of baptism deferred due to ambiguity at birth were to remain unresolved unless certainty could be retroactively established. Retroactively. As if clarity could be summoned years later without cost. Certainly, of course, could not be established. It had never been the goal. So the record would remain crossed. One clerk noted privately, not because it is wrong, but because changing it would require saying why it was crossed in the first place. This was the quiet calculus. Correcting the entry would draw attention. Leaving it untouched preserved silence. Silence was safer. Father O'Rourke was informed of the decision, not in writing. Verbally. He was told that the matter had been reviewed and that no alteration was warranted. He was advised to continue pastoral care with discretion. Discretion meant invisibility. Rourke returned to St. Brendan's with the weight of an answer that explained nothing. He saw Mayor at Mass the following Sunday. She sat where she always had, not excluded, not included. He realized then that the Church had not merely failed to decide her status. It had decided something else instead. It had decided that she would live without one. In 1914, war broke out on the continent. Attention shifted. Files were shelved again. The review ended, and Mayor's case returned to dormancy. Dormant cases are not closed. They are waiting. Mare was now in her early 40s. Her mother had died. Her father had grown quiet. Neighbors treated her with a mixture of familiarity and distance. She was present at every communal ritual, but never fully acknowledged within them. What does it do to a person to be perpetually present, yet never formally recognized? She learned to anticipate exclusion. She learned not to ask. She learned that explanation was not something the system offered willingly. In 1922, amid political upheaval and the restructuring of civil authority in Ireland, parish records were consulted by new administrators. Church registers were used to verify identities. Baptismal status was once again relevant beyond the sanctuary. Mare's absence from the register now had consequences beyond theology. When asked to provide proof of identity tied to the sacramental record, she could not. The crossed-out entry did not count. The parish could not certify. What the diocese would not recognize when institutions align. Gaps become traps. A clerk in a government office examined the parish letter. He shook his head. Incomplete, he said, and stamped the form accordingly. Once again, no accusation was made. No charge leveled. Just a designation. Incomplete. How many systems rely on the same silence without ever coordinating it? To continue following how this single crossed-out line shaped decades, and how it would eventually surface again in a context no one expected. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because in the late 1920s, a historian researching parish records noticed something unusual. A baptism was performed. A name crossed out. No resolution. And as he traced the line with his finger, he realized that this was not an error waiting to be corrected, but a deliberate absence the Church had learned to preserve. The historian did not begin with suspicion. He began with curiosity. In the late 1920s, parish archives across Western Ireland were being consulted for a project that, on its surface, appeared harmless, an attempt to document patterns of religious life before the famine and its long aftermath. Baptism rates, naming conventions, mortality. Numbers, not people. He worked in borrowed rooms, often cold, often poorly lit. Registers were laid out on wooden tables, their spines creaking when opened too far. He wore gloves not out of reverence, but because the pages stained skin. Most entries behaved as expected. Names flowed in chronological order. Corrections were rare and usually explained, but in the St. Brendan's register, something interrupted the rhythm. A name, too. Careful lines. No explanation followed. The historian paused, not because crossed-out entries were unheard of, but because this one resisted classification. Usually, a crossed-out baptism was followed by a note, entered in error, duplicate or child deceased prior to sacrament. Here, there was only the crossing itself. In time, he checked the index at the back of the book. The name appeared. Unmarked. As if the crossing had not been considered sufficient to erase it completely. This detail mattered. Indexes were updated. Deliberately, someone had chosen not to remove her name from the summary of baptisms. Someone had allowed the ambiguity to persist. Why? Leave a trace if you intend silence. The historian copied the entry carefully into his notes. He added a question mark beside it. He moved on. At first, but absence has weight. And he returned to the page again. By this period, historians were beginning to notice patterns institutions had assumed no one would ever collate. Margin alia. Corrections without explanation. Cases that did not resolve, not as scandals but as data. anomalies. He searched other registers, different parishes, different years. And he found them. Not many, but enough to form a pattern. Baptisms administered, entries crossed, language withheld. The pattern did not name its subject, but it repeated. What kind of truth only appears when cases are viewed together, never individually explained? The historian requested access to diocesan correspondence. This was more difficult. Permission was granted selectively. Files were missing, others were incomplete, but in one bundle of memoranda from the 1880s, he found a phrase that echoed across decades. Ambiguity of condition warrants discretion. Discretion again, always discretion, never definition. He understood then that these were not accidents. They were outcomes. The historian considered writing about it. Briefly. He drafted a paragraph noting unresolved sacramental records and their implications for demographic accuracy. He did not name individuals. He did not speculate publicly. The paragraph did not survive to publication. An editor marked it for removal. Not with hostility, with practicality, insufficient documentation. The margin read. Beyond scope. The omission was unremarkable. That was its power. What is left out of formal records does not disappear. It simply fails to circulate. Mare ni Chathesai never knew her name had been copied into a historian's notebook. She never knew it had been considered and set aside once more. She continued to live within the shape the Church had drawn around her. By the 1930s, she was known locally as someone apart, not shunned. Not explained. She occupied a space people navigated instinctively when she died quietly. In her sleep, the question of burial arose. This was not new. It had been anticipated for decades. The parish consulted the register. The lines were still there. The diocese was consulted again. The response was unchanged. No recognition. No prohibition. Just silence. She was buried at the edge of consecrated ground, close enough to resemble inclusion, far enough to preserve policy. No marker recorded. Why? How many boundaries exist, not to exclude but to avoid explanation? Years passed. The historian's notes were archived. The registers were returned to shelves. The diocese continued as it always had, and the case of Mare ni Chathesai remained what it had been since 1891, crossed, unresolved, to uncover how this silence persisted into modern record-keeping and why cases like this were never taught, never standardized, never explained. Subscribe and turn on notifications for the next part, because in the mid-20th century, as church authorities began modernizing their archives, a question arose that no policy memo could comfortably answer. What should be done with records that were never meant to be understood? Records whose very ambiguity was the solution, and whose clarification might reveal not a mistake, but a system that had learned how to erase without deleting at all.